Hi there, what is up, and welcome to another episode on Concepts Explained. Today's concept we're going to be looking at is authentication in Node.js. So what exactly is authentication? Authentication is the process of proving or showing something to be true or valid. In this case, we are checking to see if a user exists and if their credentials are valid. So when it comes to authenticating a user on a website or in an application, there are two main ways of handling it. The first one being with the help of cookies and sessions, and the second one will be using a signed encrypted token. In today's episode, we'll be exploring authentication using cookies and session. So in order to understand how these two things can help us with authentication, let's take a quick look at this diagrammed example. First off, we must understand how the HTTP request and response cycle functions. So HTTP is a stateless protocol, which means that there's a browser and there's a server. And at the end of every request and response cycle, the client and the server forget about each other. And this is where sessions and cookies come in handy. So this will work as follows. We have our client and we have our server, the client being our browser or our front-end application, and the server is our Node application. When the client makes a request to our server will automatically create a session and then store this session in the database. When the server responds to the client, it sends a cookie. And this cookie is then saved in the browser. This cookie will reference or point to the session that was stored in the database, because this cookie will contain the session ID. And this cookie will then be sent for every consecutive request to the server, so that the server will know who this browser or user is. Thus, we have just made this connection stateful. So now that we understand this concept, let's jump right into the code to show you how this will work in Node.js. So what I have here is just a basic Express application. I installed Express and imported with the require function, and then I initialized the Express function in a variable called app. This is all basic, app.listen on port 5000, and then I just console.log the port, and then I just have a basic route setup. So the package we're going to use to help us create these sessions and set the cookies is called npm install express-session. So what express-session does, it basically sets the needed cookie for the specified session. So this is used as follows. We can, after it's installed, we can say const session. You can name this what you want to. I'm just calling it session, and then express-session. Then we initialize a middleware with app.use, and we pass it this session variable. So this middleware will fire for every consecutive request to the server. And this session receives an object, and this object has a few options. The first one being secret. This is just the key that will sign the cookie. So this secret takes in some key, which is a string. And this key will sign our cookie that is saved to the browser. And then we have resave. This we're going to set to false. So this basically just means for every request to the server, we want to create a new session, even if we don't care about if it's the same user or browser. And we don't want this, so we set it to false. And save uninitialized basically means if we have not touched or modified the session, we don't want it to save. And this is the only three we're going to use for now. Later we're going to use a store, which will connect to our MongoDB database to store the session in our database like we showed previously. But for now, I just want to show you that this middleware creates on our request body, our request object, it creates a session that we can view. So if I save this and I run npm run dev, I'm just using Node.js and I created a dev script to run the application. I save this and I run, and I go to this localhost 5000. I can see this session being logged out. So what this piece of middleware did is it set this .session to our request object. So this request.session will stay for any consecutive request. Like I said before, when a request and response cycle has ended, there is no more communication or connection between the client and the server. They completely forget about each other. And what this session does is we can save data inside of our request.session object that would be persistent through all of the request response cycles. So if we go back to the browser and we open the developer tools and we go to application and then under cookies, we can see that there is no cookie that has been set yet. And this is because of this uninitialized that we set to false. So if I were to edit this session, say I put a variable on this session called isAuth and I set this to true and I save this, the application should restart and I refresh, then you can see this cookie being set, connect.session ID, and it has some string. This string was signed by this secret we gave it. Now if I had to go back to my code and log this session ID, console.log request.session.id, this session ID will match up with the ID in the cookie. So this is how we tell the server that this browser is using this specific session. So let's check that out. I'm going to save this. I'm just going to restart to clear it up here. I'm going to go to the browser and I'm going to refresh. If we were to view this string right here, we can see 9N8 and FBC, and we go here, we can check this string here, it's 9N8 and FBC. So that is the session ID that is stored in the cookie. So now that we understand what this package does for us, let's jump right into creating our first authentication project. So now we want to save this session inside of our database. So let's quickly set up our database. I've got MongoDB, the local setup, running in the background. So in order to use MongoDB, I am going to use a package called Mongoose, npm i mongoose. So Mongoose is just a object document model that just helps talk to MongoDB as a database in a much elegant way. So I'm going to import Mongoose and require Mongoose. I'm just going to connect to MongoDB with mongoose.connect and pass it the URI, which is MongoDB localhost. And like I said, this is on my local environment, and I'm going to call this database sessions. And for Mongoose not to complain, we have to pass in three things: use new URL parser and set it to true, use create index and set it to true, and the last one, edit to true typology. And this will send a promise, but for now we're not going to do anything with that, so we just let it connect. Okay, let's maybe use that promise. Then res, we don't care about the res, we just want to console.log MongoDB connected. Okay, with this our MongoDB is connected, so let's make sure that it works. npm run dev. We can see MongoDB is connected, so this is working fine. So now in order to save our sessions inside of this MongoDB, we are going to need another package. if you go to the documentations on Express Session and we scroll all the way down, we'll find options for storage. And one of these options, session storage implementations, one of these there, and there is a lot, as you can see, all these, and one of them is Connect-MongoDB. Right over here, Connect-MongoDB-Session. So this session, this package will allow us to save our sessions inside of MongoDB. So the setup is pretty simple and it works as follows. So we import the package npm install connect MongoDB-Session. With that installed, we can now initialize it. Just below the session variable, we can say const MongoDB-Session. We require it with connect MongoDB-Session, and then we pass it as a function, and we pass it this session variable. With that done, now we can create a store, and we're going to do this below the connection to MongoDB. We're going to say const store equals new MongoDB-Session, and we pass in a few things here. The first one being URI, and this would be the exact same URI as that we have up here. So let's refactor that into a variable. Mongo URI equals this string right here. We paste that in there, copy this and paste that in right there, as well as right in there. We give it a collection name, and this collection name will just be a string that we set to my sessions. And if I save this and pass this session variable down into the session middleware options, where we have a store option, and we pass that store right into it like so. So with this setup, it should work. So let's go check it out. I'm just going to make this smaller. Going to run my script again, npm run dev. It all works fine. I can go to my application, and when I go into MongoDB Compass and I refresh, I can see my sessions being created, and inside my database sessions I have a collection of sessions. There is no session created yet because we did not modify the session request, so let's quickly do that. In this route, I'm going to say request.session.isAuth. You can give it any variable. I'm just using isAuth as an example. Go back and refresh this. When we go to our MongoDB Compass and refresh, we can see now a session has been created inside of our database. So now we have done everything for the process to work. We have made a request to our server. The server has created a session for that browser. It has saved the session inside of the database, and we send the cookie back, and the cookie is saved inside of the browser. So now all we have to do is connect the logic of authentication and use this session to help us. So let's do that next. So what I have done here is I have just set up a few EJS views and rendered them with these res render route. So if we go take a look at our application, it looks like this right now. It really isn't pretty, but it's just to drive the point home of how these sessions and cookies work. So here is our landing page. This is the landing page of the website. You have register and login button. If I go to login, I can enter my email. I should just change that to password, and my login button. And then here I have email, username, email, and then email again. I should just change that as well. And then the page we're going to protect with authentication is this dashboard page. So if you're done signing in, you will have access to this very top secret page, and then it will have a logout button. So let's quickly fix those small things. Let's go to the views. It was on the login page. We should have password right over here. Save this, go back. into the register, we should have password here as well. So with this all done, let's start by creating the user model, because we are going to add users to our database and authenticate them. So let's start models, and inside models we create a user file, and here we're going to use mongoose once again. So const mongoose equals require mongoose. I like to extract the schema of mongoose out of the mongoose.schema like this. You don't have to do it like this. And then we create the user model, user schema. This would be of type new schema, and it's an object that has username of type string, and this will be required. Then we'll have an email field, which is of type string as well, and this will also be required. This will also be unique because we won't allow people with the same email address to register. And then we have a password of type string and will also be required. So once we set up our schema, we have to export it as a model. So we can say mongoose.model, and we give this model a name, we call it user, and then we pass it the user schema. So now with our model set up for MongoDB, we can import this model in our application. So I'm going to say const user model is equal to require in our /models/ user. I have now access to all the CRUD operations on this model. So when I go to my register route, on my register page that is loaded through EJS, I can see here this form has a wrong request. I'm glad I saw this. It should be /register and a method of post. And then from this form I will receive a username, an email, and a password. So I have already set up the body parser in the middleware right over here. app.use express URL encoded. So this will parse our bodies and give us access to the request.body. So in my register post route, so the app.post register, I can now start my authentication process. Request.body, and I will pull out the username, the email, and the password. So when we think about authentication, when a user registers, we want to check that this user does not exist in the database currently. Otherwise, two people can't register with the same email. So we're going to say let user equals, and we're going to make this asynchronous function to use async await, and then we'll search in our database model.find one who has this email. And obviously we don't want this variable to have any user in, otherwise that means it already exists. So now we check if this user exists, then we want to return to res redirect and go back to register, so they have to try again. So if this is not true, then we will continue, and now we will create our new user, and we'll say new user model, and here we create that user. We pass the username, the email, and the password. But very important, we do not want to save the string password directly into the database. We want to encrypt that password before we save it. So we are going to use a package called Bcrypt Js. So we're going to install that, Bcrypt Js. And what this will allow us to do is encrypt or hash our passwords so that they can't be changed or recognized by anyone. So let's import this package, const bcrypt equals require Bcrypt Js. And how this will work is we get this password from our body. So before we save or create this user, we can say const hashed password, and we set this equal to await because it returns a promise. Bcrypt, that variable or that package we just imported, and hash, it has a hash function on it. And this function accepts a string, which is our password we want to hash, and then we just pass it a salt. The salt will just make the hash more random. So now we have this hashed password, and we pass that hash password into our model. When our model is done created, we can now await user.save. This is a Mongoose method that saves this user we created into the database. Once we have finished created the user, we can redirect to the login page so that the user now has to log in with their created credentials. With this done, let's check if it works. Go npm run dev. No errors, everything looks fine. Let's go to application, let's go to register. Let's just close all of these up. We don't need them now. And here I can say my username is going to be Lloyd. Email is going to be lloyd@gmail.com. And password is going to be password. If I register now, it should take me to the login page. Cannot register. Again, a spelling mistake on my part. I'll quickly fix that. And now we press register. It should take us to the login page. And this has worked successfully. If we go to MongoDB Compass and we refresh, we can now see a user collection being created, and this user was stored inside there with the hashed password. So with this done, let's work on the login. The login is also fairly similar. So we're going to extract from the body. This body comes from, if we go to our template, we can see on our body we send an action to login and a method of post, which is this route, post login. And on our inputs we have an email and a password. So let's extract that. Email and password. So firstly, we want to check if this user exists. So let's create a variable called user, and on our await, so this has to be an asynchronous function, on our user model, we search for find one with this email. If this user does not exist, he can't log in, and then you have to redirect him to the login page or the register page. For this one, I'm just going to return res.redirect to /login. Okay, and if the user was found, I want to compare the passwords. So I'm going to create a variable isMatch, and I'm going to await and use this Bcrypt package again that has a compare method. And on this compare method, I pass the password I found from the body, and then the password that is saved in the database, which we found from this user we got from the database. And let's see if this is not a match. Once again, we want to return to the login screen, return res.redirect /login. And if it is a match, we want to log this user in. So we will res.redirect to /dashboard and save. So with this done, let's test it out. Go back to the application. We log in with our email we just created in the database. Use the password, which is password. If we log in, it should take us to the dashboard. And we are officially signed in. But this does not prevent the user from visiting /dashboard even if they are not signed in. So if I were to close my application and restart it and just go to /dashboard, I can still view it without logging in. So we want to prevent this. In order to do this, we're going to use a piece of middleware. So let's do that. Let's go to our middleware section, which is over here, and I'm going to create a new variable, isAuth. And this middleware will contain request, response, and next. And this middleware will check our request.session. So when we're done logging in, right over here, before we redirect, we want to save something on our session .isAuthenticated and set this to true. Now, when we get to this piece of middleware, which we're going to embed inside the dashboard, it will check for that property. So if request.session.isAuth, so if that is true, or so if it doesn't exist, it's false, but if it exists and is equal to true, that would be true, then we can call next. Else, if that is not the case, we want to res.redirect to /login. So now we can pass this piece of middleware into our dashboard like this. So now we've passed this piece of middleware to this route. So it will first check if the request is auth is set, and then you will have access to this route. So if I were to go back into our database, I'm just going to clear the server, restart. If I were to go back into the database, MongoDB Compass, refresh this and delete this current session. So on this session, it will say isAuth is true, and I want to delete this, and then make sure that on my initial routes, I do not set anything except for when I am logged in. So when I'm logged in, it is the only place it would set this isAuth. So let's test it out now. Save this, go back to our application. If I were to, which I'm not signed in right now, I'm just going to delete this cookie, which there is no cookie. I'm going to try and visit the dashboard, and it redirects me to the login page because I'm not yet signed in. But if I were to sign in right now at gmail.com, password and login, then I have access to this page, and you can see the session cookie was created. So now if I were to go back to the landing page and then go back to the dashboard, I'm still authenticated. So this cookie references to this session that was created in the database that says I am authenticated. So now let's work on the login button, and then we're basically done. The login button will basically just remove the session from the database, and there is a specific function on the express session package. So we can go app.post, and this would go to the logout. On the dashboard view, we can see that there is a form that has an action of logout with a method of post with that logout button submitting that form. So we can trigger this request response, and here we can say request.session.destroy, and this destroy has a callback with an error, and if there is an error, we will throw that error, which there shouldn't be, and then we just want to res.redirect to the landing page. With this all set up, let's go back to our application. We can refresh. We are still logged in because of this session ID, and if I log out, it throws me back to to the landing page, you can see the cookie is still here, but if we go back to the database and we refresh, we can see the database session is missing. So now if I want to go to dashboard, I would not be able to visit it. Although the cookie is still there, this cookie doesn't point to anything in the database. So it's basically null and void. So now I have to re-sign in. And if I were to re-sign in, gmail.com and password, it would create a new cookie. You can see the cookie has changed and I'm able to log in and view the dashboard. So this is how authentication works in Node.js using cookies and sessions. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, and if you did, please remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one.